In the quaint village of St. Mary's Down, a gleaming silver trophy vanishes moments after young mechanic Tom Hartley's stunning victory in the Grand Circuit race, plunging the community into a web of suspicion. Was it the envious rival, Lionel Drake, seeking revenge? The ambitious sponsor, Reginald Voss, craving control? Or the meticulous organizer, Clara Pennington, hiding a shameful secret? Only Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, can unravel the tangled motives of envy, pride, and betrayal to reveal the truth behind the stolen prize. A classic Agatha Christie mystery unfolds, where no one is quite what they seem. Chapter 1. The Triumph and the Loss. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the green of St. Mary's Down, a quaint village nestled in the rolling hills of the English countryside. The air thrummed with the fading roar of engines and the excited chatter of a crowd gathered for the climax of the annual Grand Circuit race, a tradition that had transformed the sleepy hamlet into a hub of fervor for one glorious weekend each year. The racecourse, a winding loop through meadows and past the old stone bridge, had just witnessed a spectacle. Tom Hartley, a local lad with grease-stained hands and a boyish grin, had crossed the finish line first, his cobbled-together car outpacing the sleek machines of wealthier rivals. The silver trophy, a magnificent creation of spiraling curves and engraved laurels, gleamed on a velvet-draped table in the village hall, ready to be presented to the victor. Miss Jane Marple, seated unobtrusively in a wicker chair near the hall's bay window, observed the scene with her customary quiet attention. Her delicate hands worked steadily at her knitting, the soft click of needles blending with the hum of conversation. She had come at the invitation of her old friend Colonel Bantry, whose enthusiasm for motor racing was matched only by his love of recounting military anecdotes. Miss Marple, though no aficionado of speed, found the human drama of such events far more compelling. Her pale blue eyes, deceptively mild, took in every detail. The flush of triumph on Tom Hartley's face, the forced smile of the runner-up, Lionel Drake, and the proprietary air of Mr. Reginald Voss, the race's wealthy sponsor, who stood adjusting his gold watch chain with a touch of smugness. The village hall, adorned with bunting and filled with the scent of polished wood and fresh flowers, buzzed with anticipation as Mrs. Clara Pennington, the event's organizer, prepared to officiate the ceremony. Clara, a widow known for her meticulous planning, moved with the precision of a metronome, her dark green shawl draped elegantly over her shoulders. She signaled for silence, and the crowd hushed as Tom stepped forward, his workman's boots heavy on the polished floor. The trophy, catching the light, seemed to pulse with the weight of his achievement, a mechanic's son besting the elite. Colonel Bantry, standing near Miss Marple, clapped heartily, muttering, "Jolly good show, that lad." But the moment of triumph was fleeting. As Clara reached for the trophy to hand it to Tom, her hand froze mid-air. A murmur rippled through the room, growing into a collective gasp. The table was bare. The trophy, moments ago the centerpiece of the celebration, had vanished. Consternation erupted, voices rose, fingers pointed, and Clara's face drained of color. Constable Hargreaves, stationed near the door, pushed through the crowd, his notebook already in hand, his expression one of beleaguered determination. "Nobody leave," he barked, though his authority seemed to waver under the weight of the chaos. Miss Marple, undisturbed, continued her knitting, her eyes flitting from face to face. She noted Tom's sudden pallor as if the theft were a personal affront. Lionel Drake's thin-lipped smirk quickly masked Voss's bluster as he demanded an immediate search, and Clara's trembling hands clutching her shawl as if it might anchor her. The crowd's shock was genuine, but Miss Marple knew that beneath such spectacles, motives often lurked: petty jealousies, hidden grudges, or calculated schemes. She declined Colonel Bantry's offer to join the impromptu search party, preferring to remain where she could observe. "It's curious, isn't it?" she remarked softly to no one in particular. "How quickly pride can turn to panic." As Hargreaves began questioning the guests, Miss Marple's mind turned to the village itself. St. Mary's Down was no stranger to small scandals: gossip about Tom's rivalry with Lionel, whispers of Voss's overbearing influence, or Clara's fierce pride in her flawless events. The trophy's disappearance was no mere prank. It was a deliberate act, and Miss Marple suspected the truth lay not in the silver itself, but in the hearts of those who coveted it. She folded her knitting neatly into her bag, her thoughts already weaving a pattern as intricate as the lace she crafted. The game, as she well knew, had only just begun. Chapter 2. The Gathering of Suspects. The village hall of St. Mary's Down, so recently a stage for triumph, had transformed into a scene of disquiet. The polished oak floor, still strewn with confetti from the Grand Circuit Race's closing ceremony, seemed to mock the disorder that had erupted. The silver trophy, a gleaming symbol of Tom Hartley's improbable victory, had vanished from its velvet-draped pedestal, leaving behind a stunned crowd and a flurry of accusations. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her corner by the bay window, her knitting needles clicking with unhurried precision, observed the unfolding drama with the calm detachment of one accustomed to unraveling human follies. Her pale blue eyes, framed by the soft lines of age, missed nothing. Not the flush of indignation on young Tom's face, nor the barely concealed smirk of his rival, Lionel Drake, nor the nervous flutter of Mrs. Clara Pennington's hands as she tried to restore order. Constable Hargreaves, a sturdy man with a ruddy complexion and a mustache that seemed to bristle with his exasperation, had taken charge with the dogged efficiency of a man who preferred routine to mystery. He stood by the now empty table, his notebook open, his pencil poised, as he addressed the assembled guests. "Nobody leaves until we've got to the bottom of this," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of authority, but lacking the finesse to quell the murmurs of dissent. The hall, with its high ceilings and walls adorned with faded portraits of village benefactors, seemed to close in around the suspects, each of whom stood out in the crowd like figures in a carefully staged tableau. Miss Marple, invited to the event by her old friend Colonel Bantry, had no official role in the investigation, but her presence was a quiet force. She had declined the Colonel's suggestion to join the throng near the table, preferring her vantage point where she could watch the interplay of emotions. Her knitting, a soft gray scarf taking shape under her deft fingers, provided a rhythm to her thoughts. She noted the way Tom Hartley, the victorious driver, stood with his shoulders hunched, his workman's hands clenched as if to ward off an unseen blow. Beside him, Mr. Reginald Voss, the race's sponsor, puffed out his chest, his gold watch chain glinting as he muttered about the outrage of the theft. Mrs. Clara Pennington, the organizer, hovered near the table, her green shawl slipping slightly as she wrung her hands, her usual composure frayed. And then there was Lionel Drake, the runner-up, leaning against a pillar with a studied nonchalance that did not quite mask the intensity in his dark eyes. Hargreaves began his inquiries with a methodical air, calling each suspect forward in turn. The crowd, a mix of villagers, racing enthusiasts, and a few curious outsiders, watched with bated breath, their whispers forming a low hum that filled the hall. Miss Marple, sipping a cup of tea brought by a flustered volunteer, listened as Hargreaves addressed Tom first. "Mr. Hartley," the constable said, his tone firm but not unkind, "you were the last to approach the table before the trophy was noticed missing. What do you know about this?" Tom, a lanky young man with tousled brown hair and a smudge of engine grease still visible on his cheek, straightened up, his blue eyes flashing with defiance. "I didn't take it," he said, his voice carrying the rough edge of the village accent. "Why would I? I won it fair and square. Everyone saw me cross that line." His gaze flickered briefly toward Lionel Drake, and Miss Marple caught the undercurrent of resentment in that glance. She recalled a snippet of conversation overheard at the village tea shop the previous day. Tom and Lionel had nearly come to blows after a practice run, with Lionel accusing Tom of reckless driving. The memory settled in her mind like a piece of a jigsaw puzzle, its edges not yet clear. Hargreaves scribbled in his notebook, his mustache twitching as he considered Tom's words. "You were seen near the table just before the ceremony," he pressed. "Did you touch the trophy? Move it, perhaps?" Tom shook his head vehemently, his face reddening. "I didn't go near it after the race. I was with the crowd, shaking hands, thanking folks. Ask anyone." But his voice wavered slightly, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers drummed against his thigh, a nervous habit that betrayed more than his words revealed. She wondered what might have unsettled him so soon after his triumph. Next, Hargreaves turned to Reginald Voss, whose presence seemed to fill the room despite his modest height. Voss, a man in his late 50s with a florid complexion and a penchant for loud waistcoats, stepped forward with the air of one accustomed to command. "This is preposterous," he declared, his voice booming. "I sponsored this race, paid for that trophy out of my own pocket. Why on earth would I steal it?" His small, sharp eyes darted toward Clara Pennington, and Miss Marple caught the fleeting look, as if he sought her confirmation, or her silence. Voss was a man of wealth and influence, a London businessman who had taken an interest in St. Mary's Down as a means of burnishing his social standing. But there were rumors, whispered over teacups, that his sponsorship came with strings, a desire to control the race's outcome, to favor a driver who could be molded into a marketable figure. Tom Hartley, with his working-class roots and unpolished charm, was hardly Voss's ideal champion. "Mr. Voss," Hargreaves said, undeterred by the man's bluster, "you were near the table during the preparations. Did you see anyone acting suspiciously?" Voss snorted, adjusting his watch chain with a flourish. "I was far too busy ensuring this event ran smoothly to notice such things. Ask Mrs. Pennington. She was in charge of the details." His tone carried a hint of condescension, and Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment as she considered the dynamic between the two. Voss's deflection was practiced, but his quickness to shift attention to Clara suggested something more than mere impatience. Clara Pennington was called forward next, and she approached with the measured steps of a woman who prided herself on order. Her dark hair, streaked with gray, was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat, and her green shawl, embroidered with delicate leaves, added a touch of elegance to her otherwise severe appearance. "Constable," she began, her voice steady despite the faint tremor in her hands. "I assure you, I took every precaution. The trophy was secure on the table when I last checked it, not 20 minutes before the ceremony." Her eyes, a pale gray, met Hargreaves's with a plea for belief, but Miss Marple noticed the way her fingers clutched the edge of her shawl as if anchoring herself against a storm. Clara's reputation as an organizer was impeccable. She had orchestrated the Grand Circuit race for a decade, transforming it from a local curiosity into a regional event. A theft under her watch was not merely a crime, but a personal affront. "Mrs. Pennington," Hargreaves said, consulting his notes, "you locked the hall's doors, did you not? Could someone have slipped in unnoticed?" Clara hesitated, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. "I locked them myself," she said finally, but her voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She recalled a groundskeeper's passing remark that morning, mentioned as she strolled through the village. The hall's side door had been seen ajar just before the ceremony. Clara's fastidious nature made such an oversight unlikely, and Miss Marple wondered if the lapse was deliberate, or if Clara was protecting someone. Finally, Hargreaves turned to Lionel Drake, who had remained aloof throughout the proceedings, his lean frame slouched against a pillar. Lionel was a striking figure, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire. His racing leathers, still dusted with the grit of the track, gave him the air of a man who belonged more to the road than to the village. "Mr. Drake," Hargreaves said, his tone sharpening, "you were second in the race. Where were you when the trophy went missing?" Lionel's lips curled into a faint, sardonic smile. "In the crowd, watching Hartley bask in his glory," he said, his voice low and edged with bitterness. "I had no reason to go near the table." But his eyes flicked toward Tom, and Miss Marple caught the glint of something darker. Envy, perhaps, or a deeper grudge. Hargreaves pressed further. "You've had words with Hartley before, haven't you? Something about a near collision during the race?" Lionel shrugged, his nonchalance almost too perfect. "Racing's a rough game, Constable. Hartley's reckless, but that's his business. I didn't take his precious trophy." His alibi was flimsy. No one could definitively place him in the crowd at the critical moment, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tightened around the cigarette he held, unlit as if it were a lifeline. Lionel's rivalry with Tom was no secret. The village buzzed with tales of their clashes, both on the track and off. Miss Marple recalled a particular story from the tea shop. Lionel had vowed after a heated practice session to make Hartley pay for what he called a dangerous maneuver. The words lingered in her mind, sharp as a blade. As Hargreaves continued his questioning, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her thoughts weaving through the details like threads in her knitting. The hall was a microcosm of human nature, each suspect a study in motive and opportunity. Tom's distress seemed genuine, but his nervousness hinted at a secret. Voss's bluster masked a calculating mind, perhaps one that saw the theft as a means to an end. Clara's lapse with the door suggested either carelessness, an unlikely trait, or complicity. And Lionel's bitterness was a motive in itself, a simmering resentment that could have boiled over into action. The crowd, growing restless, began to disperse under Hargreaves's orders, but the four suspects remained, their faces a gallery of unease. Colonel Bantry, red-faced and indignant, approached Miss Marple as the room began to clear. "Damn disgrace, Jane," he muttered. "Stealing a man's trophy right under our noses. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, setting her knitting aside. "It's early days, Arthur," she said, her voice soft but laced with a quiet certainty. "People are rarely as careful as they think. A trophy is more than silver. It's pride, envy, ambition. Someone wanted to take more than an object." She declined to elaborate, her eyes returning to the suspects, who now stood in a loose circle near the table, each avoiding the other's gaze. The constable, satisfied with his initial inquiries, announced that he would continue his investigation the next day, urging everyone to report any unusual observations. As the crowd filtered out into the cool autumn evening, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze settling on the empty table. The theft was bold, almost theatrical, and she suspected it was meant to send a message. But to whom? And why? The answer, she knew, lay in the small details, the glance, the gesture, the unguarded word that revealed the heart's true intent. She gathered her shawl and knitting bag, her mind already turning over the puzzle. St. Mary's Down, for all its pastoral charm, was a village of secrets, and Miss Marple was determined to unravel them. Chapter 3. The Driver's Tale. The morning after the trophy's disappearance dawned crisp and golden over St. Mary's Down, the village waking to a hum of speculation that rivaled the previous day's racing fervor. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a small table in her cottage's parlor, sipped her morning tea, her knitting resting beside a plate of buttered toast. The cottage, with its neat chintz curtains and shelves of well-worn books, was a haven of quiet order, but her thoughts were far from tranquil. The theft of the Grand Circuit Race trophy had stirred the village like a stone dropped into a still pond, and she knew the ripples would reveal more than Constable Hargreaves's blunt inquiries might uncover. Her mind lingered on Tom Hartley, the young driver whose triumph had been so abruptly tarnished. There was something in his manner the previous evening, a flicker of unease beneath his defiance that piqued her curiosity. At the village hall, where Hargreaves had set up a makeshift investigation headquarters, the constable was preparing to question Tom in greater detail. Miss Marple, invited by Colonel Bantry to observe, arrived, promptly at 10 o'clock, her black handbag tucked under her arm and her knitting tucked inside. The hall, stripped of its festive bunting, felt stark, the empty table where the trophy had stood serving as a silent accusation. Hargreaves, his notebook worn at the edges from constant use, stood by a window, conferring with a young sergeant who looked barely old enough to shave. Tom Hartley sat on a wooden chair, his broad hands resting uneasily on his knees, his blue eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple settled into a seat near the back, her presence barely noticed, her needles resuming their soft, rhythmic click. "Mr. Hartley," Hargreaves began, his voice carrying the weight of officialdom, "let's go over it again. You say you were nowhere near the trophy after the race, but several witnesses saw you lingering by the table before the ceremony. Care to explain?" Tom's head snapped up, his face flushed with a mix of frustration and indignation. "I told you, I was greeting folks, shaking hands, thanking them for their cheers. I won that race fair, and I had no reason to touch the trophy before Mrs. Pennington handed it over." His voice, rough with the cadence of the village, held a note of sincerity. But Miss Marple noticed the way his fingers twitched, as if itching to grasp something solid, perhaps the absent trophy itself. Hargreaves flipped a page in his notebook, his mustache bristling as he read from his notes. You were seen speaking with a man in a gray cap just before the ceremony. Looked like a heated exchange, according to Mrs. Dawson from the bakery. Who was he? Tom's jaw tightened, and for a moment he seemed to hesitate, his eyes darting toward the window as if seeking escape. Just a spectator, he said finally, his tone clipped. Wanted to talk about the race, that's all. I don't know his name. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. Mrs. Dawson, a notorious gossip, was not always reliable, but her observations often held a kernel of truth. A heated exchange suggested more than a casual chat, and Tom's reluctance to elaborate was telling. The constable pressed further, his questions methodical but lacking subtlety. You and Lionel Drake had a run-in during the race, didn't you? Nearly caused a crash, I hear. Bad blood between you two? Tom's face darkened, and he leaned forward, his hands clenching into fists. Lionel's got a temper, and he don't like losing. He tried to cut me off on the final turn, but I held my line. That's racing, not bad blood. His words were defiant, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of something else. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. She recalled the village whispers about the two drivers. Tom, the local hero who had built his car from scraps, and Lionel, the polished outsider with a string of victories elsewhere. Their rivalry was the talk of Saint, Mary's down, fueled by a near collision during a practice run that had left Lionel fuming, and Tom unapologetic. Hargreaves, sensing he was hitting a nerve, shifted tactics. You're a mechanic, Mr. Hartley, used to working with your hands. Easy enough to slip something as small as that trophy into a bag, maybe hide it in your garage? Tom sprang to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. That's a dirty lie, he snapped. I'd never steal what I earned. You want to search my place? Go ahead. I've got nothing to hide. His outburst drew a raised eyebrow from Hargreaves, who made a note, but Miss Marple's attention was on Tom's hands, now trembling slightly as he sat back down. Anger, she knew, could mask other emotions, and Tom's reaction suggested more than wounded pride. As the questioning continued, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the broader canvas of the village. Tom was a local lad, the son of a garage owner who had died young, leaving Tom to carry on the family trade. His victory in the race was a point of pride for Saint. Mary's down, a testament to grit over privilege. But success, Miss Marple knew, often bred envy, and Tom's rise had not gone unnoticed. She recalled a conversation at the village post office where Mrs. Tuttle, the postmistress, had mentioned Tom's recent troubles, a loan taken to fund his car's modifications, and a mysterious phone call that had left him shaken the day before the race. These fragments, like the loose threads in her knitting, hinted at a pattern she could not yet discern. Hargreaves, growing frustrated with Tom's evasions, turned to a new line of inquiry. You've been spending time at the Red Lion lately, haven't you? Heard you were there the night before the race, talking with some rough types. Care to tell me what that was about? Tom's face paled, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. Just a pint with mates, he muttered, but his eyes avoided Hargreaves's gaze. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind filing away this detail. The Red Lion was a respectable enough pub, but it attracted a mixed crowd, including some of the less savory characters who drifted through the village during race season. If Tom was entangled with such company, it might explain his unease. The constable, sensing he had struck a chord, pressed on. One of those mates wouldn't happen to have a gray cap, would they? Tom's silence was answer enough, and Hargreaves made another note, his expression one of grim satisfaction. Miss Marple, however, was less convinced. Tom's distress seemed genuine, but his reluctance to name his companion suggested he was protecting someone, or something. She thought of the village's undercurrents, the small jealousies and rivalries that simmered beneath its placid surface. Tom's victory had upended the social order, placing a mechanic's son above men like Lionel Drake, whose polished exterior and racing pedigree made him a favorite of the elite. Could that have stirred someone to act, not just against Tom, but against the very symbol of his triumph? As Hargreaves concluded the interview, dismissing Tom with a stern warning to remain available, Miss Marple rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate. She approached the constable, her smile mild, but her eyes sharp. "A word, constable, if I may," she said, her voice soft as a whisper of silk. Hargreaves, though accustomed to dismissing civilians, nodded grudgingly, aware of Miss Marple's reputation for seeing what others missed. "Young Mr. Hartley is troubled," she said, her tone conversational. "But I don't believe he's a thief. His hands, you see, they're honest hands, used to work, not deceit. But he's frightened, and fear makes a man clumsy with his words." Hargreaves frowned, unsure whether to take her seriously, but he jotted down her observation, muttering about women's intuition. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her knitting resuming its rhythm. Tom's interview had revealed more than he intended, a secret meeting, a rival's grudge, and a nervousness that went beyond the theft itself. She thought of the trophy, its silver curves a beacon of ambition and envy. Someone had taken it, not for its value, but for what it represented. As she watched Tom leave the hall, his shoulders slumped, she felt a pang of sympathy. He was a young man caught in a web not of his own making, and Miss Marple knew that the truth, like her knitting, would require patience to unravel. She gathered her things, her mind already turning to the next thread in the pattern. Reginald Voss, the sponsor, whose bluster hid a calculating mind. The day was young, and St. Mary's Down had more secrets to yield. Chapter 4. The Sponsor's Ambition. The sun climbed higher over St. Mary's Down, casting a warm glow through the village hall's tall windows, but the atmosphere inside remained heavy with suspicion. The theft of the Grand Circuit Race trophy had cast a pall over the village, and Constable Hargreaves, his notebook now a well-thumbed companion, was determined to press on with his inquiries. Miss Jane Marple, seated once more in her unobtrusive corner, her knitting needles moving with their familiar, soothing rhythm, watched as the next suspect was called forward, Mr. Reginald Voss, the race's wealthy sponsor. Her keen eyes, framed by the delicate lines of age, noted the way Voss adjusted his garish waistcoat, his gold watch chain catching the light as he strode to the center of the room with the confidence of a man accustomed to being heard. Hargreaves, standing by the empty trophy table, cleared his throat, his mustache twitching with the effort of maintaining authority in the face of Voss's imposing presence. "Mr. Voss," he began, his tone measured but firm, "you funded the trophy, and you were seen near the table during the preparations yesterday. Can you account for your movements before the ceremony?" Voss, a stout man with a florid face and small, calculating eyes, drew himself up, his voice booming across the hall. "Constable, this is an outrage. I poured a small fortune into this race, into that very trophy. Why, it's practically my property. The notion that I'd steal it is absurd." His words were laced with indignation, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of unease in his glance toward the other suspects, particularly Clara Pennington, who stood rigidly nearby, her green shawl draped tightly about her shoulders. Hargreaves, undeterred, consulted his notes. "You were seen speaking with Mrs. Pennington near the side door just before the ceremony began. Care to tell me what that was about?" Voss's face reddened further, and he tugged at his watch chain, a gesture Miss Marple recognized as a stall for time. "Merely discussing logistics," he said brusquely. "The race was my investment, and I wanted to ensure everything was in order. Mrs. Pennington assured me it was." His tone carried a hint of accusation, as if shifting blame to Clara, and Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment as she considered the dynamic. Voss was a man who thrived on control, and his sponsorship of the race was less an act of generosity than a bid for influence. She recalled village gossip about his business dealings in London, sharp, often ruthless, with a knack for bending others to his will. The constable pressed on, his questions direct, but lacking the subtlety to probe beneath Voss's bluster. "You've been vocal about wanting a proper champion for the race, Mr. Voss. Some say you favored Lionel Drake over Tom Hartley. Is that true?" Voss snorted, his hands sweeping dismissively. "Nonsense. I support talent, Constable, not favorites. Hartley won, didn't he? Though I'll admit, a lad like him, grease under his nails, no polish, hardly fits the image of a champion." His lips curled into a faint sneer, and Miss Marple noted the way his words landed like a blow. Tom, lingering at the edge of the room, stiffened, his jaw tightening, but he said nothing. Voss's disdain for Tom's humble origins was no secret. The tea shop had buzzed with tales of his attempts to sway the race's publicity toward Lionel, whose sleek demeanor and racing pedigree aligned with Voss's vision of a marketable star. Hargreaves scribbled in his notebook, his expression skeptical. "You were near the trophy table longer than most, Mr. Voss. Did you see anyone acting suspiciously? Anyone who might have had a chance to take it?" Voss's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "If you want my opinion, Constable, I'd look at young Hartley. He's got motive. Maybe he wanted to sell the trophy to pay off that loan he's been struggling with. I hear he's in deep with the bank." The accusation hung in the air, and Tom's face flushed with anger. But before he could retort, Hargreaves raised a hand for silence. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind turning over Voss's words. The mention of Tom's loan was a calculated jab, but it also revealed Voss's own knowledge of village affairs, knowledge that suggested he kept a closer eye on his rivals than he let on. She thought back to a conversation at Colonel Bantry's manor the previous evening, where Mrs. Bantry had mentioned Voss's habit of meddling in the race's organization. "He's always whispering in Clara's ear," Mrs. Bantry had said, her voice tinged with disapproval, "trying to make the event his own little empire." Miss Marple wondered if Voss's ambition extended beyond sponsorship. The trophy, a symbol of his largesse, was also a reminder of his failure to control the outcome. Tom's victory had defied his expectations, and men like Voss, she knew, did not take kindly to being upstaged. Could the theft be a way to discredit Tom, to tarnish his triumph and shift attention back to Voss's preferred narrative? Hargreaves, sensing Voss's evasiveness, tried a different angle. "You've got a reputation for being particular about your investments, Mr. Voss. Ever think the trophy might be worth more to someone else Say, a collector? Or maybe you had it insured, and a theft would be convenient? The question was bold, and Voss's face darkened, his hand clenching around his watch chain. "Are you accusing me of fraud, Constable?" he demanded, his voice rising. "I'll have you know I'm a respected businessman. That trophy was a work of art, commissioned from a silversmith in London. I'd no more steal it than I'd burn my own house down." His outrage seemed genuine, but Miss Marple noted the way. His eyes darted toward Clara again, as if seeking her reaction. There was a connection there, she sensed, one that went beyond the logistics of the race. Clara, standing nearby, shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening on her shawl. Miss Marple recalled the groundskeeper's remark about the side door being ajar, a detail Clara had denied in her own interview. If Voss had been with her near that door, as Hargreaves claimed, could they have been complicit in some way? Or was Voss using Clara as a shield, deflecting suspicion onto her meticulous but vulnerable reputation? Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked steadily, her thoughts weaving through the possibilities. Voss's ambition was clear, but ambition, she knew, could manifest in subtle ways, perhaps not in theft, but in creating the conditions for it. As Hargreaves continued his questioning, probing Voss's movements and associates, Miss Marple's attention wandered to the broader context of the village. St. Mary's Down was a place where wealth and status were quietly contested, and Voss, an outsider with deep pockets, had stirred resentment among some locals. She recalled a snippet from the village grocer, Mr. Pym, who had grumbled about Voss's attempts to buy influence with lavish dinners for race officials. "He thinks he can own us," Mr. Pym had said, "but we're not his to buy." Voss's sponsorship, while generous, came with expectations, and his disappointment in Tom's victory suggested a man who disliked surprises. The trophy's disappearance, Miss Marple mused, might serve his interests by shifting focus from Tom's triumph to a scandal he could control. Hargreaves, growing frustrated with Voss's deflections, pressed one final question. "You've got a man in your employ, a Mr. Carver, who was seen near the hall yesterday. Care to explain what he was doing there?" Voss blinked, caught off guard, and for a moment his composure faltered. "Carver? My secretary? He was running errands, delivering messages. Nothing to do with the trophy." But his voice lacked its earlier conviction, and Miss Marple's needles paused again. Carver, a shadowy figure rarely seen in the village, was known to handle Voss's less savory business dealings. If he had been near the hall, it opened new possibilities. Perhaps Voss had orchestrated the theft through a proxy, keeping his own hands clean. The constable concluded the interview, dismissing Voss with a curt nod, but Miss Marple sensed the man's relief as he stepped away, his watch chain jingling faintly. She rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate, and approached Hargreaves as he reviewed his notes. "A moment, Constable," she said, her voice soft but carrying a quiet authority. "Mr. Voss is a man who likes to be in charge, but he's not as clever as he thinks. His secretary, this Mr. Carver, perhaps you might look into his movements more closely." Hargreaves frowned, skeptical, but jotted down her suggestion, muttering about too many cooks in the kitchen. As Voss rejoined the other suspects, his bluster returning like a well-rehearsed performance, Miss Marple returned to her seat, her knitting resuming its rhythm. Voss's ambition was a thread in the tapestry of the theft, but it was tangled with others. Clara's precision, Tom's unease, Lionel's bitterness. The trophy, she knew, was more than a prize. It was a mirror reflecting the desires and resentments of those around it. She thought of her own village, St. Mary Mead, where small acts of malice often hid behind respectable facades. St. Mary's Down was no different, and as she watched Voss exchange a quick word with Clara, his hand brushing her arm, Miss Marple felt the pattern shifting. The next thread, she decided, would be Clara Pennington herself, whose meticulous nature might conceal more than it revealed. The morning was not yet over, and the village held its secrets close. Chapter 5. The Organizer's Precision. The afternoon light filtered through the village hall's tall windows, casting a soft glow on the polished oak floor, now bare of the festive trappings that had adorned it the previous day. The theft of the Grand Circuit Race trophy had left St. Mary's Down in a state of restless curiosity, and the hall, once a stage for celebration, now served as a somber arena for Constable Hargreaves's ongoing investigation. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar corner with her knitting in her lap, observed the proceedings with her usual quiet attentiveness. Her needles moved with a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm, the soft click blending with the murmur of voices as Hargreaves prepared to question Mrs. Clara Pennington, the race's meticulous organizer. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes, sharp despite their gentle appearance, lingered on Clara, noting the faint tremor in her hands as she adjusted her green shawl, embroidered with delicate leaves that seemed to quiver in the light. Clara Pennington, a widow in her mid-50s, stood before Hargreaves with the poise of a woman accustomed to order, her dark hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. Her reputation in St. Mary's Down was unimpeachable. For a decade, she had orchestrated the Grand Circuit Race with a precision that bordered on obsession, transforming a local event into a regional spectacle. The theft of the trophy under her watch was a blow to her pride, and Miss Marple sensed that Clara's composure, like a tightly wound spring, was close to unraveling. Hargreaves, his notebook open and his mustache bristling with determination, began his questioning with a directness that lacked finesse. "Mrs. Pennington," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the nearly empty hall, "you were responsible for the trophy's security. You said you checked the hall before the ceremony. How did someone get to it without you noticing?" Clara's gray eyes met Hargreaves's with a flicker of indignation, though her voice remained steady. "Constable, I assure you, I took every precaution. The trophy was on the table, secure, when I inspected the hall not 20 minutes before the presentation. The doors were locked, the windows latched. I can't imagine how anyone could have taken it." Her words were firm, but Miss Marple noted the way. Her fingers clutched the edge of her shawl, a gesture that betrayed more than her calm demeanor suggested. Clara's fastidious nature was legendary. The village tea shop buzzed with stories of her checking every detail twice, from the bunting's alignment to the timing of the race's start. A lapse in her vigilance seemed unlikely, and Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the implications. Hargreaves, flipping through his notebook, pressed further. "You mentioned locking the side door yourself, Mrs. Pennington. Yet Mr. Jenkins, the groundskeeper, says he saw it ajar just before the ceremony. Care to explain that?" Clara's face paled, and for a moment her composure faltered, her lips parting as if to protest. I must have been mistaken," she said finally, her voice softer now, almost apologetic. "I was certain I locked it, but with so much to manage, perhaps I overlooked it." The admission hung in the air, and Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Clara's concession was too quick, too unlike her. A woman of her precision did not simply overlook a locked door, especially not one critical to the event's security. The discrepancy suggested either negligence, an improbability, or something more deliberate. The constable, sensing a crack in Clara's armor, leaned forward. "You were seen speaking with Mr. Voss near that same door, Mrs. Pennington. What was the nature of your conversation?" Clara's hands tightened on her shawl, and she straightened, regaining a measure of her usual control. "Mr. Voss was concerned about the ceremony's timing," she said, her tone clipped. "He wanted to ensure the photographers were ready for the presentation. It was a brief discussion, nothing more." But Miss Marple caught the fleeting glance Clara cast toward Voss, who stood at the edge of the room, his gold watch chain glinting as he watched the proceedings with a faint smirk. The interaction, however brief, hinted at a deeper connection, one that Clara was reluctant to disclose. Hargreaves, undeterred, shifted his approach. "You've run this race for years, Mrs. Pennington. Never had a theft before, have we? Makes me wonder if someone had help, someone who knew the hall's layout, the schedule, the locks." The accusation was blunt, and Clara's eyes flashed with a rare spark of anger. "Are you suggesting I had a hand in this, Constable? I've poured my heart into this event. The idea that I'd let it be tarnished is unthinkable." Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with wounded pride, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy. Clara's devotion to the race was genuine, but devotion, she knew, could blind one to the faults of others, or to one's own missteps. As Hargreaves continued his questioning, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the village's undercurrents. Clara was a respected figure, but her perfectionism had earned her both admiration and quiet resentment. The grocer, Mr. Pym, had once remarked that Clara's insistence on control made her a bit of a tyrant. Behind the scenes, alienating those who worked under her. Miss Marple recalled a particular incident from the previous year's race, overheard at the post office. Clara had publicly reprimanded a volunteer for a minor error, her sharp words leaving the young woman in tears. Could such rigidity have created an enemy, someone who saw the trophy's theft as a way to humble her? Or was Clara's lapse with the side door a sign of something more personal? Perhaps a moment of distraction caused by an unseen pressure. Hargreaves, growing frustrated with Clara's measured responses, tried a new tack. "You've worked closely with Mr. Voss, haven't you? Some say he's been pushing you to favor certain drivers, Lionel Drake, for instance. Did he ask you to do anything unusual with the trophy?" Clara's face stiffened, and she drew her shawl tighter as if shielding herself from the question. "Mr. Voss has his opinions," she said carefully, "but I've always ensured the race is fair. He asked for nothing improper." Her denial was firm, but Miss Marple noted the slight quiver in her voice, a hint of strain that suggested Voss's influence weighed heavier than she admitted. The tea shop had buzzed with rumors of Voss's attempts to shape the race's narrative, and Clara, as organizer, was in a position to either resist or acquiesce to his demands. Miss Marple's mind turned to another detail. The scrap of green fabric she had noticed the previous day caught on a splinter near the side door. It matched the shade of Clara's shawl, a fact she had not yet shared with Hargreaves. The fabric could be a coincidence. Shawls were common enough in the village, but Clara's insistence on locking the door contradicted by the groundskeeper's account, made the coincidence less likely. Miss Marple wondered if Clara had been near the door at a critical moment, perhaps witnessing something she chose not to reveal. Her knitting needles resumed their rhythm, the soft click a counterpoint to her racing thoughts. Clara's precision was her strength, but it could also be her weakness, a facade that hid a moment of vulnerability. As Hargreaves pressed Clara on her movements, asking for a minute-by-minute account of her actions before the ceremony, Miss Marple observed the other suspects. Tom Hartley, lingering near the door, watched Clara with a mix of sympathy and suspicion, his hands still clenched as if ready to defend himself. Lionel Drake, leaning against a pillar, maintained his air of detachment, but his eyes followed Clara's every gesture, a faint smirk playing at his lips. Voss, meanwhile, seemed to grow more restless, his fingers drumming against his watch chain as Clara spoke. The interplay of their reactions was a tapestry of motives, and Miss Marple knew that Clara's testimony, however guarded, was a key thread. Hargreaves, nearing the end of his questions, asked one final probe. "Mrs. Pennington, you've got a reputation for noticing everything. Did you see anyone near the trophy table who shouldn't have been there? Anyone at all?" Clara hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the floor as if searching for an answer. "No one," she said at last, but her voice was barely above a whisper. "It was all so hectic. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary." The lie, if it was one, was subtle, but Miss Marple's keen senses caught the faltering note. Clara was hiding something, not out of malice, perhaps, but out of fear or loyalty. As Hargreaves dismissed Clara, noting her responses with a skeptical grunt, Miss Marple rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate. She approached the constable, her smile as mild as ever. "Constable," she said softly, "Mrs. Pennington is a woman of great care, but even the most careful can be distracted by loyalty or pride. That door, you see, it's not like her to leave it unlocked. Perhaps you might ask Mr. Jenkins exactly when he saw it ajar." Hargreaves frowned, but he nodded, scribbling her suggestion in his notebook. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. Clara's precision had been her shield, but it had also made her vulnerable, and the scrap of fabric by the door was a clue that could not be ignored. As Clara rejoined the other suspects, her face pale but composed, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the next piece of the puzzle. Lionel Drake, whose bitterness was as sharp as the autumn air. The trophy's theft was a knot of motives, envy, ambition, pride, and Clara's role, whether active or passive, was a thread that led deeper into the web. St. Mary's Down, with its quiet lanes and hidden grudges, was yielding its secrets slowly, but Miss Marple knew that patience, like her knitting, would reveal the pattern in time. Chapter 6. The Rival's Grudge. The late afternoon sun dipped low over St. Mary's Down, painting the village in hues of amber and casting long shadows across the village hall's stone facade. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the lingering echoes of Constable Hargreaves's earlier interrogations giving way to a new focus. Lionel Drake, the brooding runner-up of the grand circuit race. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her accustomed corner, her knitting needles moving with their quiet, relentless rhythm, observed the scene with her characteristic blend of unobtrusive calm and piercing insight. Her pale blue eyes, deceptively gentle, followed Lionel as he slouched forward from his position against a pillar, his lean frame radiating a coiled intensity that seemed to challenge the very air around him. Lionel Drake was a striking figure, his sharp features and dark, smoldering eyes marking him as an outsider in the close-knit village. His racing leathers, still faintly dusted with the grit of the track, clung to his form, emphasizing his wiry strength. Hargreaves, standing by the now infamous trophy table, adjusted his notebook with a weary sigh, his mustache twitching as he prepared to tackle the most enigmatic of the suspects. "Mr. Drake," he began, his voice carrying a hint of steel, "you came in second in the race, and by all accounts you weren't pleased about it. Where were you when the trophy went missing?" Lionel's lips curled into a faint, sardonic smile, and he straightened, his gaze meeting Hargreaves's with a defiance that bordered on insolence. "In the crowd, Constable," he said, his voice low and edged with mockery. "Watching Hartley play the hero. Where else would I be?" Hargreaves's eyes narrowed, unamused by Lionel's tone. "That's a bit vague, Mr. Drake. No one seems to recall seeing you there at the critical moment. Care to be more specific?" Lionel shrugged, his hands slipping into the pockets of his leathers. Gesture that seemed calculated to dismiss the question. "Crowds are funny things, Constable. People see what they want to see. I was there, mingling, clapping like a good sport. Ask around." But his nonchalance was too practiced, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers fidgeted in his pockets, betraying a restlessness that his words sought to conceal. She recalled the village gossip overheard at the tea shop, Lionel's vow to make Hartley pay. After their near collision on the track, a moment that had left him seething and Tom defiant. The memory was a sharp thread in the tapestry of the theft, and Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered its weight. The constable, sensing Lionel's evasion, pressed harder. "You've got a history with Tom Hartley, don't you? Witnesses say you two nearly came to blows after a practice run. Something about him cutting you off?" Lionel's smile faded, replaced by a hard glint in his eyes. "Hartley's a reckless amateur," he said, his voice dropping to a growl. "He swerved into my lane, nearly spun me out. But that's racing. I don't hold grudges. I settle scores on the track." His words were laced with venom, and Miss Marple caught the flicker of hatred that passed across his face, quickly masked. Lionel's rivalry with Tom was no mere professional spat. It was personal, fueled by a bitterness that ran deeper than a single race. She thought of her own village, St. Mary Mead, where small slights could fester into lifelong feuds, and wondered what lay at the root of Lionel's animosity. Hargreaves, flipping through his notebook, seized on the point. "Settling scores, you say? Sounds like motive to me. Taking that trophy would be a fine way to stick it to Hartley, wouldn't it?" Lionel laughed, a short, harsh sound that echoed in the hall. "If I wanted to hurt Hartley, I'd beat him on the track, not steal his shiny cup. Besides, what would I do with it? Melt it down? Hardly worth the trouble." His dismissal was swift, but Miss Marple noted the way his eyes darted toward Tom, who stood near the door, his face a mask of barely contained anger. The tension between the two men was palpable, a silent storm that threatened to break at any moment. The constable shifted tactics, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "You were seen near the village hall the night before the race, Mr. Drake, carrying a small bag. According to Mr. Pym at the grocer's. Care to explain what you were doing there?" Lionel's expression tightened, and for a moment he seemed caught off guard, his hands emerging from his pockets to cross over his chest. "Pim's got bad eyes and worse judgment," he said curtly. "I was at the Red Lion that night, having a drink. Maybe he saw someone else." But his denial lacked conviction, and Miss Marple's needles slowed as she filed away the detail. Mr. Pym, though prone to exaggeration, was not one to invent stories outright, and his mention of a bag was intriguing. Could it have held the trophy? Or something else? A tool, perhaps, to aid in the theft. Hargreaves, sensing a weak point, pressed further. "The Red Lion's a fair walk from the hall, Mr. Drake, and you've got no one to confirm you were there the whole evening, do you?" Lionel's jaw clenched, and he leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You're fishing, Constable. I don't need an alibi for a crime I didn't commit. If you want to know who took that trophy, look at Hartley. He's got debts, hasn't he? Maybe he needed the cash more than the glory." The accusation was a calculated jab, and Tom's head snapped up, his fists clenching as he took a step forward. Hargreaves raised a hand, silencing him, but Miss Marple noted the way Lionel's eyes gleamed with satisfaction, as if he relished the chaos he'd stirred. Her thoughts turned to the broader picture of Saint. Mary's down. Lionel was an outsider, a professional racer who had come to the village seeking another victory to add to his record. His polished demeanor and sleek car had made him a favorite among the wealthier spectators, including Reginald Voss, who saw in him a marketable champion. But Lionel's arrogance had not endeared him to the locals, who rallied behind Tom's underdog story. Miss Marple recalled a conversation at the post office where Mrs. Tuttle had mentioned Lionel's temper, describing how he'd snapped at a mechanic who dared to touch his car. Such a man, she mused, might see Tom's victory as a personal affront, a theft of his rightful place in the spotlight. The trophy's disappearance could be an act of spite, designed to rob Tom of his moment and cast doubt on his triumph. Hargreaves, growing frustrated with Lionel's deflections, tried one final question. "You're a man who likes to win, Mr. Drake. Losing to Hartley must have stung. Did you see anything, anyone, near the trophy table that might give us a lead?" Lionel's smile returned, thin and cold. "I saw plenty of people milling about, Constable. Voss fussing over his investment, Mrs. Pennington checking her precious schedule, Hartley soaking up the applause, but no one suspicious. Maybe the trophy grew legs and walked off." His sarcasm drew a scowl from Hargreaves, who made a note muttering about "smart Alex." Miss Marple, her knitting a steady counterpoint to the room's tension, considered Lionel's words. His refusal to offer a clear alibi, combined with his sighting near the hall, made him a compelling suspect, but she sensed his role was more complex than a simple thief. His grudge against Tom was evident, but grudges, she knew, could manifest in subtle ways, perhaps not in stealing the trophy himself, but in creating an opportunity for someone else to do so. She thought of the scrap of green fabric by the side door, the unlocked latch, and Clara's nervous denial. Could Lionel have manipulated the situation, using Clara's oversight to his advantage? Or was he, as he claimed, merely a bystander in a crime that served his interests? As Hargreaves dismissed Lionel with a curt nod, Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate. She approached the constable, her voice soft, but carrying a quiet authority. "Constable," she said, her smile mild, "Mr. Drake is a man who thrives on control, but he's not above petty revenge. That bag Mr. Pym saw, it might be worth asking what was in it, and why he was near the hall so late. Hargreaves frowned, skeptical but accustomed to her uncanny insights, and jotted down her suggestion. Miss Marple returned to her seat, her needles resuming their rhythm. Lionel's grudge was a dark thread in the mystery, woven tightly with Tom's triumph, Voss's ambition, and Clara's precision. The trophy, she knew, was a symbol of more than victory. It was a spark that had ignited hidden resentments, and the truth lay in untangling them. As Lionel slouched back to his pillar, his eyes meeting Tom's with a silent challenge, Miss Marple felt the pattern shifting. The next thread, she decided, would be found in the village itself, where whispers and secrets waited to be uncovered. Chapter 7. The Village Whispers. The evening settled over St. Mary's Down with a gentle hush, the village's stone cottages glowing softly under the fading light of an autumn sky. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl against the evening chill, walked slowly along the high street, her black handbag tucked under her arm, and her knitting left behind for once. Ostensibly, she was out to admire the season's turning leaves, their crimson and gold, a fleeting spectacle. But her true purpose was to listen to the murmurs of the villagers, the half-spoken truths that drifted like smoke through the tea shops and post office. The theft of the Grand Circuit Race trophy had set tongues wagging, and Miss Marple knew that in a place like St. Mary's Down, secrets were rarely buried deep. Her steps were measured, her expression one of mild curiosity, but her mind was as sharp as the crisp air, sifting through the threads of the mystery that had entangled the village. She began at the Rose and Crown tea shop, a cozy establishment where the scent of scones and Darjeeling mingled with the hum of gossip. Mrs. Dawson, the proprietress, greeted Miss Marple with a warm smile, her round face flushed from the day's bustle. "Terrible business about that trophy, Miss Marple," she said, setting a pot of tea and a plate of biscuits before her guest. "Never thought I'd see such a thing in St. Mary's Down." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, her pale blue eyes scanning the room. The tea shop was a hub of village life, its tables occupied by locals and a few lingering race spectators, their voices low but animated. She sipped her tea, letting the conversation flow around her, knowing that the most revealing remarks often came unprompted. At a nearby table, Mrs. Tuttle, the postmistress, was holding court, her voice carrying over the clink of teacups. "I saw Lionel Drake myself the night before the race," she declared, her eyes wide with the thrill of her tale. Skulking near the village hall he was, with a small bag in his hand. Looked shifty, if you ask me. Her companions leaned in, their murmurs a mix of intrigue and skepticism. Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. Mrs. Tuttle was prone to embellishment, but her sightings were often rooted in truth, and the mention of Lionel's bag aligned with Mr. Pym's earlier account. She made a mental note, her thoughts turning to Lionel's bitter demeanor during his questioning. A bag could hold many things, a tool, a disguise, or even the trophy itself, but it was the timing of his presence that intrigued her. As Mrs. Dawson refilled her teapot, Miss Marple steered the conversation gently. "It's curious, isn't it, how such a thing could happen under so many eyes. Did you notice anything unusual before the ceremony, Mrs. Dawson?" The proprietress paused, wiping her hands on her apron. "Well, now you mention it, I did see young Tom Hartley looking a bit peaky just before the presentation. He was on the telephone outside the hall, and when he hung up, he was white as a sheet. Didn't think much of it at the time. Nerves, I thought, after his big win. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained mild. A telephone call, she knew, could be a catalyst in a village drama, carrying news of debt, threats, or secrets. Tom's unease during his interview now took on a new shade, and she wondered who had been on the other end of that call. Leaving the tea shop, Miss Marple continued her stroll, pausing at the village green, where children played among the fallen leaves. She spotted Mrs. Bantry, the colonel's wife, walking her spaniel, and waved her over. Mrs. Bantry, a cheerful woman with a penchant for gossip, was eager to share her thoughts. "Jane, it's simply dreadful," she said, her voice bubbling with indignation. "That trophy vanishing like that. I wouldn't put it past Reginald Voss to be involved, you know. He's been hounding Clara Pennington for weeks, trying to make the race all about his precious Lionel Drake. Wanted him on every poster, every newspaper. Poor Clara looked worn to a thread resisting him." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing away this detail. Voss's ambition to control the race's narrative was a recurring theme, and Clara's strain under his pressure suggested a dynamic that might have led to her lapse with the side door. As they walked, Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of a confidant. "And there's more, Jane. I heard from Mrs. Pym that Voss's secretary, that Carver fellow, was seen near the hall the morning of the race. Not the sort you'd expect to be loitering about, is he? Always lurking in Voss's shadow, that one." Miss Marple's interest quickened. Carver, a shadowy figure rarely seen in the village's social circles, was a wild card in the mystery. His presence near the hall, combined with Voss's evasive answers about his secretary, hinted at a deeper involvement. She recalled her own observation of Voss's nervous glance during his questioning, as if he feared what Carver might reveal. "Most interesting," she murmured, her voice soft, but her mind racing. "People do talk, don't they? And in a village, there's always someone watching." Her next stop was the post office, where Mrs. Tuttle was sorting letters with her usual brisk efficiency. Miss Marple, under the pretense of mailing a letter to her nephew, engaged her in conversation. "Such a stir about the trophy, Mrs. Tuttle," she said, her tone one of gentle curiosity. "You mentioned seeing Mr. Drake near the hall. Did you notice anyone else that night?" Mrs. Tuttle's eyes lit up, eager to share her knowledge. "Well, since you ask, I did see Clara Pennington coming out of the hall late that evening, adjusting her shawl as if she'd been in a hurry. Thought it odd, her being there so late, but she's always fussing over details." Miss Marple's needles, though absent, seemed to click in her mind. Clara's presence at the hall, combined with the scrap of green fabric by the side door, painted a picture of a woman caught in a moment of distraction, or perhaps calculation. As she left the post office, Miss Marple paused by the village well, its ancient stones a silent witness to decades of secrets. The whispers she had gathered were fragments of a larger pattern. Lionel's late-night presence with a mysterious bag, Tom's unsettling phone call, Voss's pressure on Clara, and Clara's own curious behavior at the hall. Each thread pointed to a motive: envy, debt, ambition, or pride, but none yet formed a complete picture. She thought of her own saint, Mary Mead, where village gossip often held the key to unraveling a mystery. Here, in St. Mary's Down, the same human frailties were at play, magnified by the spectacle of the race and the trophy's symbolic weight. Returning to her cottage as dusk settled, Miss Marple lit a small fire and settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed as a backdrop to her thoughts. The village whispers had confirmed her suspicions. The theft was not a random act, but a deliberate strike, aimed at disrupting Tom Hartley's triumph and perhaps serving the interests of another. Lionel's grudge was the most obvious motive, but Voss's ambition and Clara's lapse suggested a web of complicity. The phone call to Tom intrigued her most. Its timing, just before the ceremony, suggested a connection to the theft, perhaps a warning or a threat that had left him shaken. And Carver, Voss's elusive secretary, was a shadow that loomed larger with each new detail. As the fire crackled, Miss Marple's mind turned to the next step. The village. Hall itself held clues: the footprint in the dust, the scrap of fabric, the unlocked door, and she resolved to visit it with Colonel Bantry the following day. The whispers of St. Mary's Down were a chorus of half-truths, but they had given her a direction. The trophy's disappearance was a drama of human passions, and Miss Marple knew that the truth, like her knitting, would emerge with patience and care. She set her needles aside, her eyes gleaming with quiet determination. The village was speaking, and she was listening. Chapter 8. A Clue in the Dust. The morning sun rose over St. Mary's Down, its light filtering through a veil of mist that clung to the village's meadows and stone walls. Miss Jane Marple, fortified by a breakfast of tea and toast, set out for the village hall with Colonel Bantry, who had secured permission from Constable Hargreaves to inspect the scene of the trophy's theft. The colonel, his face ruddy with indignation over the damned cheek of the crime, strode beside her, his walking stick tapping the cobblestones with a rhythm that echoed Miss Marple's own quiet determination. She carried her black handbag, her knitting tucked inside, but her true tools were her keen eyes and sharper mind, ready to sift through the physical remnants of the mystery that had gripped St. Mary's Down. The village hall stood at the edge of the green, its ivy-clad facade serene, but for the lingering sense of violation within. Inside, the air was cool and faintly musty, the echoes of the previous day's chaos replaced by a stillness that seemed to hold its breath. The trophy table, now bare, stood like a silent witness at the room's center, its velvet cloth slightly askew. Hargreaves was already there, conferring with his young sergeant near the side door, his notebook open and his mustache twitching with the frustration of a man chasing shadows. He nodded curtly as Miss Marple and the colonel entered, clearly skeptical of their presence, but too polite to object outright. "Just don't touch anything," he muttered, returning to his discussion. Miss Marple, her movements slow and deliberate, approached the trophy table, her eyes scanning the floor with the precision of a botanist studying rare flora. Colonel Bantry, hovering nearby, muttered about fingerprints and thieves, but she paid him little mind, her attention drawn to the faint layer of dust that had settled in the hall's less trodden corners. The cleaners, it seemed, had not yet swept since the ceremony, a small oversight that she found fortuitous. Kneeling carefully, her shawl draped over her shoulders, she examined the area beneath the table. There, barely visible in the dust, was a partial footprint, small, with a distinct heel mark that suggested a woman's shoe, too delicate for the heavy boots of a man like Tom Hartley or Lionel Drake. She straightened, her expression unchanged, but her mind alight with possibility. "Arthur," she said softly, beckoning, the colonel closer. "Do you see this mark? It's curious, isn't it? How it sits just here, where the table's shadow falls. Colonel Bantry squinted, his military bearing at odds with his puzzled frown. "Looks like a footprint, Jane. But what of it? Could be anyone's. Cleaners, volunteers, what have you." Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Perhaps," she said. "But it's fresh, and the hall was locked after the theft. Not many had reason to linger here." She filed the clue away, her thoughts turning to Clara Pennington, whose fastidious nature made her a likely candidate for such a dainty step, but also to the possibility of another woman, perhaps a volunteer or spectator, whose presence had gone unnoticed. Moving toward the side door, where the groundskeeper had reported it ajar, Miss Marple's eyes caught a glint of something caught on a splinter in the doorframe. She bent closer, her fingers deftly retrieving a tiny scrap of green fabric, its embroidered leaf pattern unmistakable. It matched Clara's shawl, a detail she had noted during the organizer's questioning. Holding the scrap delicately, she turned it over in the light, her mind weaving connections. The unlocked door, the footprint, the fabric. They were threads in a pattern. But whether Clara was a victim of circumstance or a player in the theft remained unclear. She slipped the fabric into her handbag, deciding to keep it from Hargreaves for now. His blunt approach, she knew, might trample delicate clues before they could be fully understood. Colonel Bantry, growing restless, paced the hall, his stick tapping impatiently. "What do you make of it, Jane?" "Some sneak thief slipping in through that door, I'll wager. But who?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet amusement. "People are rarely as stealthy as they think, Arthur. A thief leaves traces, not just in dust or fabric, but in the reasons behind their actions. We must look to those reasons." She moved toward the window, where the morning light revealed scuff marks on the sill, faint but suggestive of someone climbing through, or at least inspecting the possibility. The marks were too indistinct to be conclusive, but they added to her growing sense that the theft was a carefully staged act, not a spur-of-the-moment crime. Hargreaves, noticing her interest, approached with a scowl. "Find something, Miss Marple?" he asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and exasperation. She smiled mildly, her hands folded over her handbag. "Only small things, Constable. A footprint, a bit of fabric. Nothing you wouldn't find yourself, I'm sure. But perhaps you might ask Mr. Jenkins, the groundskeeper, exactly what time he saw that door ajar. Timing, you see, is everything." Hargreaves grunted, jotting down her suggestion, though his expression suggested he found her meddling tiresome. Miss Marple, undeterred, returned to her examination, her mind turning over the clues like pieces of her knitting. The footprint suggested a woman's presence, but the village hall had been bustling with volunteers, many of them women, during the preparations. Clara was the most obvious candidate, but Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Bantry's mention of a young volunteer, Miss Eliza Gray, who had assisted Clara and was known for her admiration of Lionel Drake. Could Eliza, eager to please her idol, have played a role? The fabric, too, pointed to Clara, but shawls were common, and a clever thief might have used a similar one to cast suspicion elsewhere. The scuff marks on the window, though, hinted at an outsider's entry, or an attempt to make it appear so. Miss Marple thought of Lionel's sighting near the hall with a bag, and of Voss's elusive secretary, Carver, whose presence was a shadow in the mystery. Each clue was a thread, but the pattern was still elusive. As she and the colonel prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused by the trophy table, her eyes lingering on the empty velvet. The trophy's absence was a wound to the village's pride, but it was also a mirror reflecting the desires and resentments of those involved. Tom's triumph, Voss's ambition, Clara's precision, Lionel's grudge, each had a stake in the drama, and the clues in the dust suggested a moment of opportunity seized by someone with access and motive. She thought of Saint Mary Mead, where small acts of malice often hid behind respectable facades, and knew that St. Mary's Down was no different. The theft was a human act, driven by human passions, and the truth lay in understanding those passions. Outside, the mist had lifted, and the village buzzed with its usual rhythm, though the undercurrent of gossip was stronger than ever. Colonel Bantry, sensing her preoccupation, suggested tea at his manor, but Miss Marple demurred, her mind already turning to her next move. "I think, Arthur," she said, her voice soft but firm, "that we might invite our suspects to tea this evening. People reveal themselves over a teacup, you know, when they think no one's watching." The colonel chuckled, accustomed to her cryptic ways, and agreed to arrange it. As they parted, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the clues, the footprint, the fabric, the scuff marks. They were fragments of a story, and she was determined to piece them together. The village hall had spoken, and its whispers, like those of St. Mary's Down, would lead her closer to the truth. Chapter 9. The Tea Party Trap. The evening at Bantry Manor was a study in contrasts, the warm glow of lamplight against the chill of an autumn night, the clink of fine china against the undercurrent of suspicion that hung over the gathering. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair by the fireplace, her knitting a soft gray blur in her lap, presided over the scene with the quiet authority of one who understood the power of a well-placed question. Colonel Bantry, ever the genial host, had invited the four suspects, Tom Hartley, Reginald Voss, Clara Pennington, and Lionel Drake, to tea, ostensibly to discuss the race's aftermath, but, in truth, to provide Miss Marple with a stage to observe. The manor's drawing-room, with its polished mahogany and faded tapestries, was a fitting backdrop for the drama, its elegance a veneer over the tension that crackled like the fire in the hearth. Mrs. Bantry, bustling about with a silver teapot, played her role with enthusiasm, her chatter about the weather and the village fete a deliberate contrast to the gravity of the occasion. "Such a pity about the trophy," she said, pouring tea for Tom, who sat stiffly on a velvet settee, his workman's hands awkward around the delicate cup. "But I'm sure it'll turn up, won't it, Jane?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her pale blue eyes scanning the room. "Oh, I expect so, Dolly," she replied, her voice soft but laced with intent. "Things have a way of revealing themselves when one watches closely." Her words, innocuous to the untrained ear, set the tone for the evening, a subtle challenge to the suspects gathered around her. Tom Hartley, his face still bearing the flush of his earlier indignation, sipped his tea with a grimace, as if its refinement offended him. Reginald Voss, resplendent in a burgundy waistcoat, occupied an armchair with the air of a man holding court, his gold watch chain glinting as he gestured expansively. Clara Pennington, her green shawl draped tightly over her shoulders, sat primly on a stool, her gray eyes darting nervously between her companions. Lionel Drake, leaning against the mantelpiece, maintained his air of studied detachment, his dark eyes flickering with a mix of amusement and defiance. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking steadily, noted each detail. Tom's clenched jaw, Voss's forced joviality, Clara's fidgeting hands, and Lionel's calculated aloofness. The room was a chessboard, and she was ready to move her pieces. She began with a seemingly casual remark, her voice light as she stirred her tea. The race was quite the spectacle, wasn't it? Such a triumph for young Mr. Hartley. But I wonder, Tom, how it felt to stand by that table, knowing the trophy was yours. Tom shifted uncomfortably, his cup rattling in its saucer. "It felt grand, Miss Marple," he said, his voice rough but earnest. "Till it was gone, that is. I didn't take it if that's what you're getting at." His defensiveness was palpable, and Miss Marple noted the way. His eyes avoided Lionel's, as if the rival's presence was a weight he couldn't bear. She smiled reassuringly, her needles never pausing. "Of course not, dear. I only meant it must have been a proud moment, spoiled by such an unkind act." Turning to Voss, she tilted her head, her expression one of innocent curiosity. "Mr. Voss, you've been so generous with the race. That trophy was a fine piece, wasn't it? Almost too fine to be left. Unattended, perhaps?" Voss puffed out his chest, his voice booming. "Indeed it was, Miss Marple. A work of art, commissioned from a top silversmith. I'd have thought Mrs. Pennington would have kept a closer eye on it." His words carried a barb, and Clara's face tightened, her fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the gesture, recalling the scrap of green fabric by the side door. "Oh, I'm sure Mrs. Pennington did her best," she said mildly. "But even the most careful plans can be disrupted by unexpected visitors." Clara, catching the hint, paled slightly, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I checked everything, Miss Marple. The doors, the windows, everything was secure. I can't understand how it happened." Her words were fervent, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted toward the side door, as if revisiting the moment of her lapse. She steered the conversation toward the door itself, her tone conversational. "That side door, Mrs. Pennington, such a small thing, but so important. Mr. Jenkins mentioned it was ajar, didn't he? Odd for a locked door to be overlooked." Clara's hands froze, and for a moment she seemed to struggle for words. I must have been distracted," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It was a hectic day." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind filing away Clara's reaction. The admission, however reluctant, confirmed her suspicion that Clara's oversight was no mere accident. She turned her attention to Lionel, who had remained silent, his lean frame still propped against the mantelpiece. "Mr. Drake," she said, her voice gentle but probing, "you must have been disappointed, coming so close to victory. Did you notice anything unusual near the trophy table? You have such a sharp eye for detail on the track." Lionel's lips curled into a thin smile, his eyes meeting hers with a glint of challenge. "Noticed plenty of people fussing about, Miss Marple. Voss barking orders, Clara checking her lists, Hartley lapping up the applause, but nothing out of the ordinary." His tone was smooth, but Miss Marple caught the slight rattle of his teacup as he set it down, a crack in his otherwise flawless composure. The room grew quieter, the suspect's unease palpable, as Miss Marple's questions wove a delicate net. She mentioned the footprint in the dust, her voice almost whimsical. "It's curious, isn't it, how a little dust can tell a story? A small footprint near the table, as if someone paused there, perhaps watching the trophy." Clara's hand tightened on her shawl, and Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the green fabric, its embroidered leaves a mirror to the scrap she had found. Voss, seizing the moment to deflect, leaned forward, his voice loud. "Sounds like Hartley's doing, if you ask me. A lad like him, desperate for cash, might have staged the whole thing for attention." Tom's face flushed, and he half rose, his voice sharp. "That's a lie, Voss, and you know it. I'd never." Mrs. Bantry, quick to intervene, refilled his cup, urging him to sit. Miss Marple, unruffled, steered the conversation back to Lionel. "Mr. Drake, I hear you were near the hall the night before the race, with a bag. Just a small thing, but villages do talk. What might you have been carrying?" Lionel's smile vanished, and his eyes narrowed, his voice cold. "Gossip, Miss Marple. I was at the Red Lion, not the hall. Whoever saw me was mistaken." But his fingers twitched, and Miss Marple noted the way Clara glanced at him, a flicker of fear in her eyes. The tea party, she knew, was doing its work, stirring the pot of secrets that simmered beneath the suspects' facades. As the evening wore on, Mrs. Bantry's chatter kept the atmosphere light, but the tension never eased. Miss Marple's questions, seemingly idle, had struck chords. Clara's faltering denial, Lionel's rattled composure, Voss's quick accusation, and Tom's raw distress. Each reaction was a clue, a glimpse into the motives that drove the theft. She thought of the footprint, the fabric, the unlocked door. Small details that pointed to a deliberate act, orchestrated by someone with access and intent. Lionel's grudge seemed the strongest thread, but Clara's lapse and Voss's ambition were equally compelling. Tom, she sensed, was a victim, his triumph the target of another's envy. As the suspects prepared to leave, Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her smile as mild as ever. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice warm but with a hint of steel. "It's been most illuminating." The suspects departed, their faces a gallery of unease, and Colonel Bantry, pouring himself a brandy, chuckled. "You've got them rattled, Jane. Think you've solved it yet?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Not quite, Arthur. But people, you see, are never as careful as they think. A teacup can reveal as much as a footprint." She gathered her things, her mind already turning to the next step. A closer look at Lionel Drake, whose bitterness was a shadow that loomed larger with each passing moment. Chapter 10. The Rival's Mistake. The morning mist had burned away, leaving St. Mary's Down bathed in the crisp clarity of an autumn day. The village, though outwardly serene, hummed with the undercurrent of speculation that had followed the theft of the Grand Circuit Race trophy. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her cottage's cozy parlor, sipped her morning tea, her knitting resting beside her as she turned over the events of the previous evening's tea party at Bantry Manor. The suspects, Tom Hartley, Reginald Voss, Clara Pennington, and Lionel Drake, had revealed more than they intended, their reactions like threads in the intricate pattern she was weaving. Lionel's rattled composure, in particular, had caught her attention, his sharp retort about the bag near the village hall, a crack in his otherwise polished facade. She knew the next step was to probe deeper into his actions, and she resolved to act swiftly. At Miss Marple's suggestion, Colonel Bantry had arranged for Constable Hargreaves to search Lionel Drake's lodgings at the Red Lion Inn, a modest establishment on the village's outskirts that catered to race visitors and itinerant racers. Miss Marple accompanied the colonel, her black handbag tucked under her arm, her expression one of mild curiosity, but her mind as sharp as the morning light. The inn's tap room was quiet, its wooden beams and worn tables empty save for a few locals nursing early pints. The innkeeper, Mr. Harrow, a wiry man with a perpetual squint, greeted them with a nod, his curiosity piqued by the constable's presence. "Mr. Drake's in his room, second floor," he said, gesturing toward the narrow staircase. "Bit of a loner, that one. Keeps to himself, mostly." Hargreaves, his notebook at the ready, led the way, his heavy footsteps echoing on the creaking stairs. Miss Marple followed, her steps light but purposeful, her eyes scanning the inn's dim corridors for anything out of place. Lionel's room at the end of the hall was small but tidy, its single window overlooking the village green. Lionel stood by the bed, his lean frame tense, his dark eyes narrowing as Hargreaves announced the search. "What's this about?" he demanded, his voice low and edged with defiance. "You've no right to barge in here." Hargreaves, unfazed, produced a warrant, his mustache twitching with determination. "We've reason to believe you know more about that trophy than you're letting on, Mr. Drake. Step aside." As Hargreaves and his sergeant began their search, Miss Marple lingered near the doorway, her gaze sweeping the room. The sparse furnishings, a bed, a wardrobe, a small desk, offered little in the way of hiding places, but she knew that cleverness often lay in simplicity. Lionel leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his expression a mix of irritation and wariness. "You're wasting your time," he said, his tone clipped. "I told you, I was at the Red Lion the night before the race, not sneaking around the hall." But Miss Marple noted the way his fingers drummed against his arm, a nervous tick that betrayed his calm exterior. She thought of the village whispers, Mrs. Tuttle's sighting of him with a bag, Mr. Pym's corroboration, and wondered what he might be concealing. Hargreaves, methodical but lacking subtlety, rummaged through the wardrobe, finding only racing leathers and a few shirts. The sergeant checked under the bed, pulling out a dusty suitcase that contained nothing but spare parts for Lionel's car. Miss Marple, however, was drawn to the floorboards near the desk, where a faint scuff mark suggested recent disturbance. She knelt, her movements slow to avoid drawing attention, and ran her fingers along the edge of a board. It was loose, lifting, slightly under her touch. "Constable," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "You might look here." Hargreaves, startled by her intervention, joined her, his skepticism evident but tempered by her reputation. With a grunt, he pried up the board, revealing a small cavity beneath. There, wrapped in a green scarf embroidered with leaves, was the missing trophy, its silver surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. A collective gasp filled the room, and Lionel's face drained of color, his hands dropping to his sides. "That's not mine," he said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't put it there." But his protest lacked conviction, and Hargreaves's eyes gleamed with triumph as he lifted the trophy, careful not to smudge any prints. Miss Marple, her expression unchanged, noted the scarf, its pattern an exact match for Clara Pennington's shawl, confirming her suspicion about the scrap of fabric found by the side door. The discovery was a breakthrough, but it raised new questions. Had Lionel acted alone, or was the scarf a deliberate plant to implicate Clara? Hargreaves, his notebook forgotten in the excitement, turned to Lionel, his voice stern. "Care to explain this, Mr. Drake? Found in your room, wrapped in a scarf that looks mighty familiar." Lionel's jaw clenched, and for a moment he seemed poised to bolt, but the sergeant's presence by the door kept him rooted. "I told you, I didn't take it," he said, his voice rising. "Someone's setting me up. That scarf, it's not mine. I don't know how it got here." His eyes darted toward the window, as if seeking escape, but Miss Marple's calm gaze held him in place. She stepped forward, her voice gentle but probing. "Mr. Drake, you were seen near the hall with a bag. Could someone have used that moment to place the trophy here, knowing you'd be suspected?" Her question was a lifeline, but it carried a challenge, and Lionel's hesitation was telling. After a long pause, he slumped against the wall, his defiance crumbling. "All right," he said, his voice low. "I took the trophy. I wanted to ruin Hartley's moment, make people doubt him, think he'd staged it. But I swear, I didn't keep it here. I hid it in the woods behind the hall, wrapped in my own jacket. Someone must have moved it, put it in that scarf to point at Clara." His confession was halting, and Miss Marple's needles, though absent, seemed to click in her mind. Lionel's motive, envy and spite, was clear, but his claim of being framed added a new layer to the mystery. The scarf, she knew, was no accident. It was a calculated move, either to shield Lionel or to ensnare Clara. Hargreaves, satisfied with the confession, signaled his sergeant to restrain Lionel, but Miss Marple raised a hand, her voice soft but firm. "One moment, Constable. Mr. Drake's story is plausible, but incomplete. That scarf, you see, it's too convenient. Perhaps you might ask Mrs. Pennington if she's missing hers." Hargreaves frowned, his triumph tempered by her intervention, but he nodded, jotting down her suggestion. Miss Marple's mind turned to Clara's nervous demeanor at the tea party, her faltering denial about the side door. If Lionel was telling the truth, someone had retrieved the trophy from the woods and placed it here, using Clara's scarf to muddy the waters. But who? Voss, with his ambition to control the race, or another player, yet unseen? As Lionel was led away, his head bowed, Miss Marple lingered in the room, her eyes scanning the floorboards for further clues. The scuff mark, the loose board, the scarf. They were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture was still incomplete. She thought of Saint Mary Mead, where acts of malice often hid behind clever misdirection, and knew that St. Mary's Down was no different. Lionel's grudge had driven him to theft, but the scarf suggested a deeper game, one that implicated Clara and perhaps shielded another. She turned to Colonel Bantry, who stood gaping at the trophy, his indignation replaced by awe. "Well, Jane," he said, "you've done it again. Found the blasted thing." Miss Marple's smile was mild, but her eyes gleamed with quiet determination. "Not quite, Arthur. The trophy is found, but the truth is still hiding. We must speak to Mrs. Pennington." As they left the inn, the village stirring with news of the discovery. Miss Marple's thoughts were already on Clara. The scarf, the unlocked door, the footprint in the dust. These were threads that pointed to her, but whether as culprit or pawn, Miss Marple could not yet say. The truth, she knew, lay in the human heart, and the next conversation would bring her closer to unraveling it. Chapter 11. The Organizer's Secret. The late morning air in St. Mary's Down carried a faint chill, a reminder of autumn's deepening hold, as Miss Jane Marple made her way to the modest cottage of Mrs. Clara Pennington. The village was abuzz with the news of the trophy's recovery from Lionel Drake's lodgings, but Miss Marple's mind was far from settled. The discovery of the silver trophy, wrapped in a green scarf matching Clara's, had shifted the mystery's focus, raising questions that demanded answers. Her black handbag tucked under her arm, she walked with the unhurried grace of one. Accustomed to unraveling secrets, her pale blue eyes scanning the village's quiet lanes for the subtle signs that others overlooked. The scarf, the unlocked side door, and Clara's faltering demeanor at the tea party were threads in a pattern that pointed to a deeper truth, and Miss Marple was determined to tease it out. Clara's cottage, a neat stone dwelling with a garden of late-blooming roses, exuded the same meticulous order as its owner. Miss Marple knocked softly, and Clara opened the door, her face pale and her gray eyes shadowed with strain. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice tight but polite, "this is unexpected. Please, come in." The parlor was as precise as Clara herself, polished furniture, a vase of fresh flowers, and not a speck of dust to be seen. Yet the air felt heavy, as if the room held secrets as tightly as Clara clutched her composure. She offered tea, her hands trembling slightly as she set out the cups, and Miss Marple accepted with a gentle smile, settling into a chintz-covered chair with her handbag at her side. "I won't keep you long, Mrs. Pennington," Miss Marple began, her voice soft, but carrying a quiet authority. "The trophy has been found, as I'm sure you've heard, in Mr. Drake's room, wrapped in a scarf remarkably like yours. It's a curious thing, isn't it? How such a detail can complicate matters." Clara's cup rattled in its saucer, and she set it down, her fingers twisting together in her lap. "I heard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I assure you, Miss Marple, I had nothing to do with it. My scarf. I noticed it missing yesterday, but I thought I'd misplaced it during the chaos of the ceremony." Her words were earnest, but Miss Marple noted the way. Her eyes avoided hers, darting toward the window as if seeking escape. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Of course, dear. Misplacing things does happen, especially in such a flurry. But that side door, you see, it's been on my mind. You were so certain you'd locked it, yet Mr. Jenkins saw it ajar. And then there's the scrap of fabric, just like your scarf, caught by the door. Small things, but they do add up." Her tone was gentle, almost conversational, but it carried a weight that made Clara stiffen. For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the tick of a mantel clock. Clara's hands clenched and her face crumpled, the facade of precision giving way to a flood of emotion. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, her voice breaking, "I didn't steal the trophy, I swear it, but I saw something, and I didn't speak up." Her confession came in a rush, as if a dam had burst. "The night before the race, I was at the hall, checking the decorations. I saw Lionel Drake outside near the side door with a bag. He looked furtive, and I suspected he was up to no good. But I was so afraid of a scandal ruining the race, my race, after all these years of work. So I left the door unlocked, thinking if anything happened, it would be found quickly, and no harm done." Her eyes filled with tears, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple set her cup down, her expression softening with sympathy, but her mind sharp as ever. There, Mrs. Pennington," she said, her voice soothing. "It's a heavy burden, keeping such a secret. But why not tell Constable Hargreaves? It might have saved so much trouble." Clara looked up, her face streaked with tears. "I was ashamed," she whispered. "I've always prided myself on perfection, on making the race flawless. To admit I'd made such a mistake, it was unbearable. And then, When the trophy vanished, I thought perhaps it was my fault, that I'd let Lionel take it by leaving the door open. Her voice broke again, and Miss Marple reached out, patting her hand gently. The confession clarified much, but it also raised new questions. Clara's decision to leave the door unlocked explained the opportunity for the theft, but the scarf's presence in Lionel's room suggested a deeper layer of deception. Miss Marple thought of the tea party, where Clara's reaction to the mention of the footprint had been so marked, and the scrap of fabric found by the door. "Your scarf, Mrs. Pennington," she said gently. "When did you last wear it?" Clara frowned, wiping her eyes. "The day of the ceremony, I think. I was so busy, I didn't notice it was gone until later, but I swear, I didn't leave it in Lionel's room." Her sincerity was convincing, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the possibility of a third party, someone who had taken the scarf to implicate Clara, perhaps to shield Lionel or to confuse the investigation. She recalled the village whispers, Voss's pressure on Clara to favor Lionel, the sighting of his secretary, Carver, near the hall, and Tom's mysterious phone call. Could Carver, acting on Voss's orders, have retrieved the trophy from Lionel's hiding place in the woods and planted it in his room with Clara's scarf? Or was there another player, perhaps the elusive Miss Eliza Gray, the volunteer who admired Lionel? Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by Clara's voice, now steadier. "Miss Marple, do you think Lionel took my scarf to make it look like I was involved? He's never liked me, thought I was too strict with the race rules." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained grave. "It's possible, dear, but people are rarely so straightforward in their malice. We must look to the why as much as the who." Rising from her chair, Miss Marple thanked Clara for her candor, her smile warm, but her mind already racing ahead. "You've been most helpful, Mrs. Pennington, and don't be too hard on yourself. Pride can make us all a little blind." Clara nodded, her face still pale but relieved, as if unburdening herself had lifted a weight. Miss Marple stepped out into the village, the roses in Clara's garden, a vivid contrast to the tangle of secrets within. The scarf, the unlocked door, and Clara's silence formed a clearer picture, but the mystery was not yet solved. Lionel's confession had pointed to a frame-up, and Clara's admission suggested she had unwittingly played into someone's hands. The question was whose. As she walked back toward her cottage, Miss Marple thought of St. Mary Mead, where small acts of deception often hid larger truths. Clara's lapse, born of pride and fear of scandal, had set the stage for the theft, but the scarf's presence in Lionel's room was a deliberate act, one that required access and intent. Voss's ambition loomed large, his secretary a shadow in the background, but Miss Marple also considered Tom's distress and the phone call that had left him shaken. The trophy, she knew, was a symbol of more than victory. It was a spark that had ignited envy, ambition, and shame. She resolved to speak with Hargreaves, to ensure the scarf was examined closely, and to keep an eye on Carver, whose role remained elusive. The truth, like her knitting, was nearly complete, but one final thread waited to be pulled. Chapter 12. The Restoration. The soft glow of twilight settled over St. Mary's Down, the village's stone cottages bathed in the gentle hues of an autumn evening. The air carried a quiet anticipation, as if the village itself sensed that the mystery of the stolen Grand Circuit race trophy was nearing its resolution. Miss Jane Marple, seated once more in the Bantry's drawing room, sipped her tea, her knitting a soft gray presence in her lap. The room, with its polished mahogany and crackling fire, was a haven of warmth, but her mind was as sharp as the evening's chill, weaving together the threads of the case. Lionel Drake's confession, Clara Pennington's reluctant admission, the green scarf, and the faint footprint in the dust. The truth, she knew, was close, and tonight's gathering would tie the final knot. Colonel Bantry had arranged a quiet ceremony at the village hall to restore the trophy to Tom Hartley, a gesture meant to heal the wound inflicted by its theft. The hall, stripped of its earlier chaos, was now adorned with simple decorations, fresh flowers, and a single banner proclaiming the race's success. A small crowd had gathered, villagers, a few race enthusiasts, and the key figures in the drama, Tom, Clara, Reginald Voss, and Lionel, who attended under Hargreaves's watchful eye, his wrists bound by the constable's authority. Miss Marple, invited as a guest of honor, sat near the front, her eyes scanning the faces around her, noting the interplay of relief, shame, and lingering unease. Constable Hargreaves, his mustache bristling with a mix of pride and exhaustion, stood by the trophy table, the silver prize gleaming once more on its velvet cloth. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of officialdom, "the trophy has been recovered thanks to diligent police work, and Mr. Lionel Drake has admitted to its theft. Justice will be served, and young Mr. Hartley will receive his due." The crowd murmured approval, but Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind turning over the loose ends that Hargreaves's blunt conclusion had not addressed. Lionel's confession, while damning, had included a claim of being framed. The scarf, he insisted, was not his doing, and Clara's admission of leaving the side door unlocked suggested a broader conspiracy. Tom Hartley stepped forward to accept the trophy, his boyish face flushed with a mix of pride and relief. His workman's hands, still bearing traces of engine grease, trembled slightly as he grasped the silver, and the crowd's applause was heartfelt, a collective exhale for the village's hero. Yet Miss Marple noted the shadow in his eyes, a lingering unease that echoed the mysterious phone call Mrs. Dawson had mentioned. She leaned toward Mrs. Bantry, seated beside her, and murmured, "He's glad to have it back, Dolly, but something still troubles him. People, you see, carry their secrets even in triumph." As the ceremony concluded, Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but purposeful, and approached Hargreaves, who was basking in the crowd's approval. "Constable," she said, her voice soft but firm, "a splendid resolution, but I wonder if we might have a word with Mr. Voss and Mr. Carver before the evening ends. There's a small matter of the scarf that puzzles me." Hargreaves frowned, his triumph dimmed by her persistence, but he nodded, accustomed to her uncanny insights. Voss, standing nearby, overheard and approached, his gold watch chain glinting as he adjusted his waistcoat. "What's this about, Miss Marple?" he blustered. "The thief's caught, the trophy's back. Let's move on, shall we?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, her smile mild but unyielding. "Oh, I quite agree, Mr. Voss, but loose ends are such untidy things. That scarf, you see, it was Clara's, yet found in Mr. Drake's room, and your secretary, Mr. Carver, was seen near the hall. Curious, isn't it, how these details align?" Voss's face reddened, and he tugged at his watch chain, a gesture Miss Marple had come to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "Carver's a busy man," he said brusquely. "Errands, that's all. Nothing to do with this nonsense." But his eyes darted toward the door, where Carver, a lean, sallow man with a perpetually guarded expression, lingered in the shadows. Miss Marple turned her attention to Carver, her voice gentle but probing. "Mr. Carver, you were near the hall the morning of the race, weren't you? Perhaps you noticed something. A scarf, perhaps, or someone near the side door." Carver's eyes narrowed, and for a moment he seemed poised to deflect, but Miss Marple's steady gaze held him. I might have seen Mrs. Pennington's scarf," he admitted, his voice low. "It was on a chair in the hall, left behind during her preparations. I picked it up, meaning to return it, but I got busy." His words trailed off, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind fitting the final piece into place. She turned to Clara, who stood nearby, her face pale but composed. "Mrs. Pennington," she said softly, "you left your scarf behind, and Mr. Carver found it, but someone used it to wrap the trophy, placing it in Mr. Drake's room. Not Mr. Drake, I think, but someone who wished to confuse matters." Her eyes flicked to Voss, whose bluster had faded, replaced by a tense silence. "Mr. Voss," she continued, "you wanted a champion who fit your vision, someone like Mr. Drake, not young Tom. When Tom won, it upset your plans. Did you perhaps instruct Mr. Carver to retrieve the trophy from the woods, where Mr. Drake hid it, and place it in his room with Clara's scarf to cast suspicion on her?" Voss's face flushed crimson, and he sputtered, "This is preposterous. I'd never—" But Carver, under Miss Marple's unwavering gaze, crumbled. "It was Mr. Voss's idea," he said, his voice barely audible. "He wanted Hartley discredited, thought a scandal would shift the spotlight to Drake. I took the scarf, wrapped the trophy, and hid it in Drake's room. I didn't mean for it to go this far." The confession stunned the room, and Hargreaves, recovering quickly, signaled his sergeant to detain Carver. Voss, his bluster deflated, stammered an apology, his ambition laid bare. Clara, tears in her eyes, stepped forward. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said, her voice trembling. "I let my pride blind me." Miss Marple patted her hand, her smile kind. "We all make mistakes, dear. It's what we do after that matters." Lionel, released from his restraints after Carver's confession, glared at Voss but said nothing, his bitterness tempered by the truth. Tom, clutching the trophy, looked at Miss Marple with gratitude, his earlier unease replaced by relief. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple returned to the Bantry's manor, settling by the fire with a fresh cup of tea. Colonel Bantry, pouring himself a brandy, chuckled. "You've done it again, Jane. Unraveled the whole mess over a scarf and a footprint." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she picked up her knitting. "People, Arthur, are never as clever as they think. A trophy is just silver, but it shows us what lies in the heart: envy, pride, ambition. All it takes is a little patience to see it." The fire crackled, and St. Mary's Down settled back into its quiet rhythm, the mystery solved, the trophy restored, and Miss Marple's needles clicking steadily into the night.